beginner sewing mistakes. Tell me about it. And dear sewing friends, if you were to ask me, I can tell you that I can probably outdo anybody out there by the enormous amount of beginner sewing mistakes that I've made. And some of them are funny and some of them were not so funny and almost made me quit sewing. But the important lesson is that we can always learn from our experiences and our mistakes, and remember that practice makes perfect. And in today's video, I would love to share with you some of those funny things that I did when I first started sewing in order to give you a little push and a little confidence that, listen, if I can do it, then you can do it for sure. Remember, sewing is fun. It's not that difficult. It just requires practice. So yeah, let's get started. Okay, so you guys know me. I like everything to be in like bullet points and categories and stuff like that. That's just the way I think. It's easier for me that way. And there is that technical side of it, you know, when you actually like sew a seam wrong or choose the wrong length of the stitches or the wrong fabric or the wrong foot or blah, 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 anything else. And then there's that mental side of it, right? When you just have the wrong attitude, or you just overlook something, or you just lack follow through or practice or whatever else. So today I want to talk to you about the mental side of it, what happens right over here. And then if you want more specific technical stuff, like hands-on stuff, let me know in the comments below, and I would love to do a video on that as well. But the first one is actually on the technical side on my list of beginner sewing mistakes that I've made, and that is not opening your sewing machine manual. And I know it's super, I mean, it's so sad. I look back at it now and I'm like, are you serious? So it's a funny story. When I was 18, I moved out of my parents' place and I moved into this very, very little small room in the city center, and I rented that. And before I could buy anything else, seriously, before I could buy anything else, I had like a really crappy little blanket on my bed, and I didn't even have like a bed sheet. But before I could buy anything else, you know what I bought? A sewing machine. And the actual shop was so far away from where I lived that I had to pay for delivery, and that was 10 years ago. So that maybe even a little bit, actually more than that, 11 years ago. And no Amazon Prime at that time, seriously. So I had to pay like $40 on top of the price of the sewing machine for it to be delivered. And it got delivered. It was the side-loading bobbin machine. And you know, of course, I did open my sewing machine manual and everything else. Then fast forward 5 years, we moved to United States, and my husband bought me a sewing. I had to sell my previous sewing machine, and my husband bought me a brand new sewing machine that I still have till this day right now. And guess what? It's the top-loading bobbin machine. And it never once occurred to me to open the manual, because I thought, I am so mighty. I know everything there is to know about sewing machines and who there is to teach me anything else. And guess what? The first, like, I don't know, week or so, I was complaining to my husband that nothing is coming out. The stitches aren't even. Something is not right. It's just like, it's not holding together. And guess what? Of course, I was loading it incorrectly because I failed to open the sewing machine manual. And this is the overlocker manual, actually, because I do keep it handy all the time, and I actually reference to it all the time, because it's not because it's difficult. It's not difficult to work with an overlocker, just because there's a lot of settings, and it's always nice and handy to have them you know, by your side, so that way you can change the stitch setting for your flat seam, for your serger seam, 3-thread seam, and whatever. But yes, please open your sewing machine manuals. Learn from my mistakes, don't repeat those. There's a lot of useful information in there, especially about needles and types of needles for the types of fabric and stitch length and this and that. So open the manual. This next one is a funny story as well, and you know what, although these are my beginner sewing mistakes that I'm sharing with you today, I read all of the comments that you guys leave underneath all of the videos that I've shared with you, and from those comments I get a sense that quite a few have probably ended up in the same boat as I was. And this happened during the same time frame. I don't remember exactly now what it was or what did I do in the last year of high school, but I had these leftover fabric dyes that I used for some sort of special project, and I I thought, well, you know what? Now I have a sewing machine, and guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to buy this beautiful piece of white silk. I'm going to dye it, and I'm going to hem it, and I'm going to make a gorgeous silk scarf for myself. And guess what? I went to Abacan. It just so happened that I lived 15 minutes up the street from Abacan Fabrics. And those of you who live back in Europe, you're probably familiar with Abacan Fabrics. I absolutely love them. Not sure what's the quality right now, but 11 years ago, yeah. And they would sell fabric, they would weigh the fabric, and they would sell fabric by the kilograms. So I went there, I bought this beautiful piece of white silk, I dyed it, and guess what? That was my first ever sewing project. Did I know what I was doing? Heck no! And for those of you who have ever sewn with silk, you know that you have to have a brand new needle, preferably very nice thread so that it really slides through. You have to adjust your stitch setting. You have to really master that rolled hem so that everything is nice and even, and those corners as well, especially when you start stitching with silk, you know, you have to hand crank it nice and easy so to give yourself a little bit of room to work with. Did I know that on my first sewing project? No. Why in the world did I start with a silk scarf? I have no idea. Why couldn't I start with a tote or like a cotton napkin or I don't know, something, or a pillowcase? I didn't have a pillow. Why didn't I start with a pillowcase? I have no idea. But what happened was my sewing machine, of course, chewed up all that silk, and then I had to open my bobbin, which was side loading bobbin. I had to open my bobbin, and then I had to like figure out how do I cut that gunk of thread that happened, you know, between the plates, so that way I can actually get it out and continue sewing in my sewing machine. And the moral of the story is start simple. Learn your basics, learn how to operate a sewing machine. It's a very intriguing, very exciting to jump in these fantastic sewing projects so that way you can wear something that you love. But hey, please learn from my mistakes. Start simple. After that, I did start simple. I was like, oh, okay, maybe I should start with something that's a little bit less complicated, a little bit more beginner friendly than sewing a silk scarf. This one is really hard for me to accept in any field of life, not just in sewing. I do expect perfection right away. I'm a very fast-paced person. I really get excited about things and I jump into them, and I like to master things as soon as I can get my hands on it. And with sewing, practice makes perfect, and it was really hard for me to accept that you make the seam, it's not straight, you rip it out. You make the seam, it's not straight, you rip it out, and then you repeat it like 5 times when you first start sewing until you really get a nice crisp straight seam on your hem or whatever else you're doing. So that's another thing to remember when you just start sewing or anything else in life. And for me, now that I look back at it, yeah, that was one of the things that I'm like, you know what, it's just not happening for me. I just can't do sewing. How difficult it is to do a straight seam. Well, it's not that difficult. You just have to take your time. And right now, if I could tell this to my younger self, I would definitely do that. I would say, you know what, take your time, master it, master it, master it. Start simple, and then you will see some amazing results down the road. So definitely, I hope you will learn from that, that don't expect perfection right away, otherwise you'll be greatly disappointed. It's very interesting to see how this one is very much connected to all of the other, beginner sewing mistakes that we just spoke about. And after I started realizing that, I can't expect perfection right away. It's not going to happen in a blink of an eye. I actually need to put in some work and practice and persistence and, just really, really dive into it. I started simple and started with simple projects, and it took some enormous amount of time to really get those nice straight seams and crisp lines and just really that result that I had really high expectations for myself, and I still do. So it took, some time to get there. And I started sliding into that illusion, and I'll call it illusion because I don't think that sewing is difficult. It's not that easy. It's not like super easy, but it's also not that difficult. But I started sliding into this illusion that sewing is just literally a rocket science, and I can't seem to figure it out. And maybe it's time for me just, call it. And I think that it's very dangerous to end up there in that spot, because when you don't start simple and you dive into things without understanding how they work, that's when you get really confused. And I like to make an analogy with math. You know, when you start learning about math and, you know, multiplying things and adding things and subtracting things, you don't start with advanced algebra, do you? No, you start with 1 plus 2, 2 plus 3, 3 plus 4, whatever. You don't start, you know, solving super difficult mathematical equations, you know, right away. No, you have to get there, and it takes years. Same with sewing. I mean, you have to start simple. So I wish there would be somebody back then, you know, 11 years ago, that would have said to me that, listen, you will get there. It's not that difficult, but you have to understand the processes before you get to the result. And once you do that, everything was really going to fall into place. And it did. But back then, it really felt like a rocket science. So it was one of the beginner sewing mistakes on my part that I really saw it in a more complicated light than it actually was. So sometimes it's nice to take a step back and really realize that, hey, it's not that difficult. It's not a rocket science. This next one is like a double-edged sword for me, and I'm so happy that I broke away from it a couple years ago, and I talk about it in my videos all the time. That's the story behind it, and I'm sure you've heard me say, look beyond the pattern envelope. Well, when I first started sewing, and I understood that, you know what, I do have to start simple, and I have to master things first before I move on to more complicated garments and things like that. When I would buy a pattern or Burda style or anything else, I would follow the pattern. You know, I would really try my best because I'm really stubborn and it's really hard for me to follow, you know, everything that's written down. So I really try to follow, you know, to the T. But then once you gain the sewing skills and confidence, it kind of really becomes hard to break away from that because you almost start to be dependent on the fabric suggestions, the construction, instructions and everything else. And you almost stop thinking on your own. You just kind of follow blindly what it says. And in reality, there are multiple ways that you can do things, and there are multiple other scenarios that this whole thing can go down. And yeah, it was really hard for me to learn that. And I did, and I'm so happy that I did. And that's what I always try to kind of preach in my videos, that, hey, listen, there's multiple ways how you can do it. I'm just showing you one of the ways that I like to do it, but you can do this way or that way, or add whatever else you would like to add to it. So yes, you know, not following the pattern was the first beginner sewing mistake, not understanding that somebody who wrote the pattern probably knows a little bit more about sewing than I do when I'm just first starting to sew. And then not being able to break away from it was another beginner sewing mistake for me. So when I first got my sewing machine, I was thrilled. I was overwhelmed with joy. I mean, that was a very exciting time in my life. You know, my dream finally came true. I got the sewing machine. And the next thing that happened on the wave of that excitement, I started looking into purchasing some really fun fabrics and thinking about creative designs and, almost extravagant things too. All those beautiful dresses and skirts and things with frills and whatnot. Only to realize a couple of years later that, you know what, all those beautiful things you only wear once, twice, maybe 3 times if you're lucky. And of course it depends on your lifestyle as well. But for a student, believe me, there's nothing more useful than basics. And it took me some time to realize, and that's the reason why right now in all of the conversations that we have and all of the videos, I always say that sew your basics, because basics is what you will wear the most, and that's where you're going to invest your sewing skills, your sewing time, and you will wear those garments with pride and understanding that, wow, I made it and I wear it every day. And it took me a long time to realize that, and that was one of my biggest sewing mistakes as a beginner, that I really, it's like going shopping when you're super hungry and you fill up your basket with like potato chips and sweets and junk food and stuff like that, only to realize that you have nothing to cook with when you arrive home. It's the same thing, when you don't know your personal style, and on that wave of the excitement, you start looking up, dresses and this and that and that. So my biggest advice for you would be sew what you're actually going to be wearing. And that was one of my biggest beginner sewing mistakes. Let's be honest here. And let me ask you this. Do you expect your sewing to look exactly like the ready-to-wear clothes that you see in stores? If the answer is yes, then so did I. And there I failed to realize that A, not all sewing in stores is quality sewing. B, unless you have all of the extensions of the sewing machine, like the serger or overlocker or cover stitch machine or embroidery machine, a lot of times it's almost nearly impossible to imitate things and make them look exactly like the store-bought. And see, it shouldn't look like store-bought. It should be quality made, and it should look neat, and it should, look nice and appealing, and it should look like it was meant to look like that, right? The sleeves should be the same length, the hem should be even. But you don't need to make it look like store-bought if you don't want to. I mean, it's handmade. It's unique. It's you. That's what makes it so special. You should not have the ready-to-wear clothing as your, of sewing. It's, I failed to realize that a lot of times sewing in stores sucks. So that was another beginner sewing mistake that I had, that I thought that, well, I should make everything look like it was store-bought. No, that's the point of sewing, to make it yours and to make it special and to make it unique. Make it look nice, even, and everything else, but make it yours. So this was a little chattier than I usually do in the videos, but I do hope that the extra words gave you a little push and a little pep talk and kind of reminded you that not everything is a smooth sailing, and it doesn't have to be. You have to find joy, learn from your mistakes, push through, and remember that it's just sewing. It's fun, it's exciting, it takes a little bit of time, but it's not rocket science. You can definitely do it. Remember, if I can do it, then you can do it for sure. And I truly hope that you enjoyed this video and it gave you a little bit of a push. And do let me know if you want to hear more about the technical side of beginner sewing mistakes. Guys, thank you so much. All the best wishes to you. Push it through, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.